Today it is my honor to interview intellectual historian Elad Carmel, who is currently working as a postdoctoral researcher here at the University of Jyväskylä in the Project Center in Renaissance and Early Modern Philosophy, funded by the Research Council of Finland. Welcome, Elad.
Thank you so much.
Happy to have you here. And Elad has previously been working on the Enlightenment philosophy and the freethinkers, and he's also the author of this magnificent book. So first of all, Elad, welcome, and would you first want to tell a little bit of your background and the research you have conducted before and how it has led into your ongoing projects?
Thank you so much, Malin. It's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Jyväskylä. Previously, I completed my DPhil at the University of Oxford, where I started my work on Hobbes and deism, which ultimately resulted in this recently published monograph by Manchester University Press, Anticlerical Legacies, the Deistic Reception of Hobbes from 1670 to 1740. So this book tells the story of Hobbes' reception in the late 17th and early 18th century in England by a group of thinkers and writers who are often commonly referred to as deists and freethinkers, which are labels that started originally actually as insults and were then reclaimed and reappropriated by some of them. And the book explores the ways in which they developed and used Hobbesian ideas, sometimes invoked Hobbes' authority openly even, to draw their own anti-clerical conclusions. What I show is that Hobbes offered a range, quite a wide range, of anti-clerical ideas and methods that could be used by different authors in different ways and for different reasons. But for all of them, there was a common goal to fight what Hobbes had called the kingdom of darkness and what the deists and freethinkers called priestcraft, that is, the attempts of the clergy to gain independent political power that will be a competing power to the power of the state, which for Hobbes was a serious cause of civil disorder and civil war. And for the deists was a political problem as well as a religious problem. And so together they attempted in multiple ways to take away the power of the clergy and the claim of the clergy to have independent political power by exposing what they thought were the strategies used by the priests to gain this power. They used different strategies for that, different kinds of ideas, including materialistic ideas, deterministic ideas, Erastian ideas, tolerationist ideas, and what I show in the book is that in all of them there was some kind of Hobbesian presence.
This is so interesting, and I see that you have continued working on the freethinkers and also on the toleration and religious tolerance, because I read your recent article on a figure who is rather unknown in the history of philosophy, namely Robert Wallace, who apparently continues this freethinking tradition and was a contemporary of Hume, right? So how is the freethinking tradition continued in Wallace and his son George Wallace's thinking?
Thank you. So what is very interesting, and this is a research that I have started to work on as a fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at Edinburgh University, IASH. What is very interesting about Robert Wallace is first that he's a very interesting but understudied figure of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was indeed a contemporary of Hume, and he was in very close contact and discussion with Hume on a number of issues. The most famous one is their discussion of the population of the world between ancient and modern times. But they were discussing other issues as well, and had their disagreements, which were quite substantial, but yet very polite and enlightened in the spirit of the sort of Scottish Enlightenment that they were both part of. And what is particularly interesting in Robert Wallace for me is the way in which he shows a very unique, sort of like distinct future of these free thinking ideas that I explore in the book. Because Robert Wallace responds to many of the free thinkers I write about, such as Anthony Collins or Matthew Tyndall, later in Scotland as well, William Dudgeon, and he thinks they went too far. He thinks they were too radical. He thinks especially that their anti-clericalism was exaggerated. And this is also his main argument with Hume. So Hume has a famous footnote where he writes about, in his essay on national character, he writes specifically about the character of the clerics, to whom he attributed greed and ambition and superstition and fraud, very much in line with the other free thinkers. And Robert Wallace takes issue with that. And he thinks that this kind of anti-clericalism is exaggerated. And Robert Wallace, it's important to mention, was himself a clergyman, and quite a senior one in the Scottish Church, or in the Kirk. And what is interesting about what Robert Wallace is doing is that he also reappropriates the same label of free thinking by calling himself a moderate free thinker. So his idea, his point is to say, well, you can be a free thinker without being anti-clerical. In fact, you can be a clergyman and still call yourself a free thinker. And that was not a small point, because free thinking at the time was very much associated with atheism or heterodoxy or infidelity, and to see it reappropriated not only by these radicals but also by a moderate free thinker, a clergyman, was a very interesting way in which the debate on free thinking continued in different ways and in different geographical places as well.
In your article, I found it interesting that you point out that the question of population, you just mentioned, was one of the most pressing questions of the time, which might come as a surprise to many that philosophers were that much interested in discussing a topic of population. And I found it interesting that Robert Wallace's point on population was actually also connected to he's basically what could be taken as a pro-slavery.
Right, so this debate was indeed followed quite closely by many on the continent, and it was a very interesting debate. And Hume and Wallace had opposite theses in this debate. Hume's idea or argument was that the population of the world increased with time, whereas Wallace argued that the population of the world decreased between ancient and modern times. And he gave different reasons for that. And this is something, this is an interesting part, and indeed the issues of slavery and race are quite crucial to this debate, as has been pointed out quite recently by Silvia Sebastiani in her excellent book on gender and race. In fact, in his published texts on this, especially when we compare them to the drafts of the lectures that he gave on this issue, in the published texts, he very much emphasizes that he does not advocate for slavery at all, that any kind of slavery, civil, ecclesiastical, or domestic, is egregious and wrong. He emphasizes that. He emphasizes that he does not endorse it at all. And so there is this puzzle. Why then, or how can we reconcile, if at all we should reconcile, this idea of someone who does not support slavery, but then does somehow find that slavery had a positive effect in the ancient world? How do we reconcile that? And then to add to that, George Wallace, Robert Wallace's son, was the most radical anti-slavery writer in Scotland in the middle of the 18th century. And he, less than a decade after Houman Wallace debated this question of the population of the world, George Wallace in 1760 published a 600-page book on the system of the law in Scotland. He's a legal writer mostly. And within that book there is something like 10-page essay on slavery. Whereas George Wallace makes the most explicitly radical argument in Britain by that time against slavery, arguing that there is no justification to be found for slavery, not by natural law, not by the law of nation. Slavery is categorically wrong. And his point is not only ethical, but it's also legal, because his argument is that whenever enslaved people are brought to Scotland, they should immediately be declared free. So he talks very much both about ancient slavery and contemporary colonial slavery, arguing that there is no place for slavery in Scotland and that enslaved people in Scotland should be immediately declared free. What is interesting is that this is before this actually happened. So only more than a decade later, the same thing actually happens in Britain, with the case of Somerset in England and Knight in Scotland, who were indeed declared free by the British court. So George Wallace writes before that, so very early on, and he's also influenced by his father, the same writer who had more complex views on the role of slavery in the history of the world. So he takes this notion of his father, Robert Wallace, against extensive trade and implements it on the question of slavery, to question both the slave trade and slavery itself.
I find it fascinating that in the history of Western philosophy we have had a writer like George Wallace, who sounds so interesting and topical and radical, as you describe, but we literally don't seem to know almost anything about him. Like he's not included in the standardized volumes of history of Western philosophy. Am I right that we might soon expand our knowledge on George Wallace because your future project will center around his thinking? Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. So my future project as a Marie Curie Fellow here at the University of Jyväskylä will look at questions of free thought, gender, and anti-slavery ideas in 18th century Britain, where George Wallace will be one of the main case studies, because I'm very interested in his political and legal thought that brought him to reach these, again, very early, very radical, very explicit anti-slavery views. I'm interested in the intellectual context in which he was brought up and in which he studied at the University of Edinburgh, with influences such as his father and David Hume, and both sort of like the intellectual and legal circles in which he was moving. I'm interested in his own political thought, as I mentioned, and I'm also very interested in the reception of his work. So a lot of my work, like in this book, is about not only ideas but also the reception. What is interesting about George Wallace is that he's one of these figures who was actually quite well received at the time. The book was not a major success at all, but it was read and used by abolitionists in France, in the United States as well. And only then he was forgotten. In the 1970s, he was mentioned by David Byrne Davis, and that was pretty much it. So I'm also very interested sort of like in the immediate reception of his work, the way that it was translated and influential for abolitionists, both philosophically and politically, and then also how he was forgotten after that, and the ways in which he can be very, very relevant and timely today.
Now, it seems to me that you are also interested in this kind of, if we may call it like recovery history, because you have focused on many thinkers who have not been studied that extensively as a part of Western history of philosophy, like Robert and George Wallace, but also Mary Hayes. And you now are working on a project on Mary Hayes. So maybe we could start by introducing her, because she's one of these figures in Western thought that I think many people don't know, even if they definitely should.
Mary Hayes is a fascinating character. She was a contemporary of Mary Wollstonecraft. They were born the same year. They were both very active in sort of like the London radical circles of the 1790s, those who were in favor of the French Revolution, those who were also quite radical religiously, again, so they were Unitarians or rational dissenters. And they were also sort of like associated with the new rational philosophy, such as William Godwin as well, who eventually married Mary Wollstonecraft. And Mary Hayes, in fact, reintroduced them before they got married. So Mary Hayes is very much in these circles in the 1790s, and she wrote also very similar texts to Wollstonecraft in the 1790s, where she advocated what she called primarily the emancipation of the female mind. So this idea, if we make the connection to free thinking, that free thinking is the right of one to use their own reason in religious matters and in others. And what Mary Hayes essentially does is to take this right and make it the right of women as much as it is the right of men to use their own reason. So she very much emphasizes the values of self-liberation and self-education and self-emancipation in this sense for women in the 1790s. Again, in a time, exactly the same time as Mary Wollstonecraft is doing precisely that. Both of them wrote literary as well as philosophical texts. Mary Hayes has, for example, important philosophical texts from 1793, Letters and Essays. She has her best-known novel, Memoirs of Emma Courtney, from 1796, which is also semi-autobiographical, reflecting on her own position as a woman who finds her way in the world of critical and indeed dissenting philosophy.
But Mary Hayes seems to have been doing something like that herself do? Because I have a personal interest in Mary Hayes's work, Female Biography, because she includes several ancient female philosophers, which has been one of my more recent research topics. And she also includes the famous Cynic philosopher Hipparchia. And this I find highly interesting because even many recent contributions on Western philosophy or ancient philosophy exclude Hipparchia. She's still not regularly or standardly recognized as one of the major ancient philosophers, or even necessarily mentioned at all. But Mary Hayes does include Hipparchia in her account of female thinkers in this work. And for this I find that she's doing something quite unusual and even quite radical in her time. Do you know what were her reasons behind this rather unusual undertaking, as it seems, of writing the female biography?
The female biography is an excellent example of Hayes' enterprise and political goals as well. The female biography is a 6-volume work from 1803, and Hayes worked on it for several years before, and it is a collection of histories of women from the entirety of history, ancient to modern, that is Hayes' own times, including more than 300 women, philosophers, noble women, poets, and many more. Also from different regions of the world, mostly European, but not only. Matoka or Pocahontas is the only Native American figure there, and this is quite an interesting entry as well. Queens, of course, both Eastern and European. So a very impressive project. It is not an original project in the sense that she relied very much on sources that were available to her, including previous dictionaries or different kinds of encyclopedias that had entries on women in history. But it is indeed quite radical and very impressive in the way that it is dedicated for women. It has only women and a large number of them. It is a genre that was quite popular at the time. What is interesting to see, and I hope this answers your question, is the reasons that she gives for doing that. And this is something that she writes already in the preface, that she writes that for women, especially for younger female readers. And I believe that her goal is twofold. She wants to inspire them by showing this amazing collection of women who followed their own path and their own ambitions and liberated themselves or educated themselves. This is something that Hayes emphasizes in many of the entries. And I think she also wants to show her readers that such an undertaking can be done. So, in a sense, she herself is part of the story, the way that she did something that not many other women in her time did. So she herself was self-educated. She was an autodidact. She herself compiled these entries and the vast information that she included there. So I think she truly wanted to inspire her readers to teach themselves and to follow their interests like she did, and like many of the characters that she included in the biographies did themselves.
Well, it seems to me that the way she's reiterating Hipparchia's stories is actually emphasizing exactly many of those points you just said, because at least in my reading, it seems that Mary Hayes is very much emphasizing the part in Diogenes Laertius originally, where Hipparchia says that she's leaving her shuttle by the loom and dedicating her life to Paideia. And it seems that this is an important point for Hayes, because she is telling exactly this part of Hipparchia's biography somewhat differently from Diogenes Laertius, and actually framing it as if this line was uttered in a tragedy recital, which seems to be a reference to Euripides. But she seems to emphasize a lot this part where Hipparchia is leaving the traditional female role that the ancient economics reserved for the wife at home, stereotypically preoccupied by spinning inside of the women's quarters of the oikos, and instead going to philosophical life and what she calls paideia.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really interesting, and I'm very interested in your work on Hipparchia and the intersections with Hayes on this, because I think this is a very interesting example of reception, right? Of the reception of these figures by someone like Hayes. And I think with reception, we always see there is always a reason, there is always a specific use of ideas, of characters, right, for the goals of the writer, of the present writers. And I think for Hayes, it is very clear that her work of female biography is a work of reception of these figures in order to adapt them or adapt the stories that she tells of them to her own political goals, feminist or proto-feminist, if you want to call it this way. And in Hipparchia's case is really very nice to see. She, as you mentioned, she cites this sentence that Hipparchia says, well, who would challenge my choice, right, to occupy myself by philosophizing rather than by spinning. And this is interesting because, first of all, because it is portrayed as a choice, right? So a lot of these ancient women that Hayes portrays are models for both sort of wisdom and philosophy, and also for their resolution and determination and their choice. And Hayes, exactly, I think this is what she does in many of these entries. She emphasizes, I think she gives very objectively the information that she finds. And not all entries are only favorable to all the women. I do think she tries to portray them as complex people, and she even sometimes say, well, people are complex, so these women were also complex. But she does emphasize, right, these kind of things that help her create these sort of like models, these protagonists, these heroines. And I think in Hipparchia's case, it's really nice that she chooses that sentence because it correlates so well, it corresponds so well with much of what Hayes says in her literary and philosophical, and indeed in her biographical texts as well. So this idea of a woman choosing philosophy over spinning is something that comes up time and again in Hayes' own writings. We see that in the 1790s, where she asks at some point, she says, I wonder if there's going to be any sewing in the next life, then what would they do, all these women who only sew in this life? And I think this is an excellent sentence in many ways because it brings some kind of religious criticism as well. And this idea that women should be really be taught or be self-taught, more than sewing, right? For Hayes herself, it is clear that what she chose was, among other things, philosophy. She often mentions, she also in her correspondence, she often writes about her own difficulty in her household because her opinions were sometimes hard for her family to hear. So she reflects on that, and then in her literary works, the many of the female characters she describes, Emma Courtney, who is modeled after Hayes, for example, are exactly this kind of women who don't take the traditional path, who don't stick to sewing and spinning, but who do read, who do think, who do free think on religious matters and on other matters. And this image comes up again and again. We see that in a novel from 1815, yeah, that she wrote, that she describes a character who is not only sewing and spinning, but is a strong female character who is knowledgeable about all household matters. So this is very interesting to see how the female biography is part of Hayes', as I said, enterprise as a whole, and how these images keep returning, and how she also used, somewhat like these freethinkers, she used different strategies to convey her message to her audience, and perhaps to different audiences, to audiences who will read the philosophical text, for audience who will read her literary text, and for audiences who are interested in the 6-volume female biography.
It is fascinating because this juxtaposition between education and spinning or weaving seems to have a very long history, since, as I mentioned, in ancient literature, spinning and weaving are a reoccurring example of women's domestic tasks, which are defined as indoor works as opposed to outdoor work or outdoor labor, which is then dedicated as the man's sphere of life, which obviously does not only refer to work in the fields, but more generally to political life, military life, and economic life, right? So it is very closely intertwined with access to power. And even Hellenistic and Roman thinkers who were debating questions like education, like Musonius Rufus, who is indeed suggesting that the Roman fathers should, to some extent at least, educate their girls, but even he has to answer the question, but should the boys then learn to spin? And of course that would be way too radical. Of course he's not suggesting quite that. And the Stoic Hierocles, on the other hand, is wondering whether it might be okay for a man to learn to weave or to spin. And he basically concludes that, well, if they're free of absurd superstitions and confident in their masculinity, it might be okay. But it was clearly something to be debated, something that occupied the philosophers' minds.
That is very interesting, and it just makes me think of, so I think it's also very interesting to see the intersections of gender and race in different entries in the female biography and in other works by Hayes. And I think it's interesting also, sort of like what you mentioned, but so like maybe gender performances. So in Hayes' female biography, for example, we see Queen Christina, who is known or portrayed for her sort of like masculine conduct and behavior and dressing. And this is an issue that I think was quite well known, but Hayes takes it and sort of like develops in a sort of like almost queer sort of like portrayal of Queen Christina as somebody who is who escapes traditional gender roles and performances. I think also one more aspect that we can add to that, and of course Queen Christina is also very, again, well and self-educated, which is in a way another way of escaping traditional gender roles. Another issue that I think would be interesting to add to our conversation is that for Hayes, education and emancipation go clearly hand in hand. And a lot of it is, as I mentioned, is the idea of self-education and self-emancipation. But the term emancipation in itself is interesting because, of course, in the 1790s it is primarily used in the debates on slavery and abolition. And Hayes is one of the few writers who seem to actually think of emancipation in what we would call today in an intersectional way. So she thinks of emancipation both for women, but not only. And she does acknowledge the wrongs of slavery and of colonialism. And her female protagonists or heroines do speak up against all kinds of injustices. I mentioned that she includes Matoka in her female biography, and in her own novel on Emma Courtney, which again is sort of like a semi-autobiographical novel, the main character, the female character who is portrayed as a free thinker, also speaks up against slavery and in confrontation with slaveholders. So this idea of a woman free thinking and speaking up and talking about emancipation both for women and for enslaved people and even for enslaved nations, I think is very unique.
I would like to bring together some of the keywords of our conversation this far. Performative way of doing philosophy. This is indeed something I think is relevant if we want to include figures like Hipparchia in the history of philosophy, because she has been often excluded on account of, well, we don't have any written text by her, so she can't really be included in the history of ancient philosophy. But on the other hand, if we read her acts and her way of life as expressions of her philosophy, and if we read as an embodied and performative praxis, then indeed we have evidence of Hipparchia's philosophy. So we have the performance, right? You also mentioned queer, and you have mentioned gender and all of these topics. So this logically leads us to the Eurovision Song Contest. And you indeed has just come back from Malmö, from the Eurovision Song Contest, where you participated in a panel on the Eurovision, and you provided some academic perspectives on the Eurovision in an interview. So would you like to tell us more about the Eurovision Song Contest?
Absolutely. I'm always happy to talk about the Eurovision Song Contest, which indeed brings, I think you said it perfectly. It brings all of these topics together and more. I have been a Eurovision fan for many, many years, but only within the last couple of years I have also started to work on it as a scholar. Thanks to Ayash that I mentioned at the University of Edinburgh, I organized a workshop last year with wonderful participants talking on many different aspects of Eurovision. And the topic that I chose for that workshop was, broadly speaking, political and queer theory in the Eurovision Song Contest. And that is closely related to the panel that I was on this year in Malmö, at Malmö University, which questioned the idea of the Eurovision and the new Europe. And we were debating with scholars such as Karen Fricker and others, this idea that Eurovision was meant to lead to some kind of new Europe. Of course, Eurovision started after the war, and the idea was to bring love and peace to the continent. The slogan this year, and not only this year, has been united by music. And this idea of uniting Europe and celebrating diversity and inclusion, and this has of course been challenged very heavily in recent years with many political developments, while Eurovision is trying very hard to claim that it remains non-political or apolitical. Of course, this claim is heavily challenged. Especially has been challenged this year.
But could you tell me more about the utopia of the Eurovision and the ideals of inclusion as opposed to practices of exclusion and inclusion that were highly debated this year? Because this is a very interesting topic to me that I feel is also in many ways connected to what we were discussing before.
Of course, there was a specific idea of Europeanness behind the Eurovision, and this is something that has been investigated also scholarly, and I think is very interesting. There is a very interesting work being done on it, because of course this utopian or European vision of Europeanness and Eurovision has also been closer to what we would call the Western ideals. And so there is this idea of is it actually utopian? Is it actually European? And is there actually an agreement on what are the values that are being celebrated and highlighted? And I still think that there is, to a large extent, agreement that it is and it does want to stay as a celebration of diversity and inclusion. But then, of course, especially with the queer and LGBTQ+ community that became a huge audience of this Eurovision, which then interacts with the performances and the songs as well, especially in the past 20-25 years. But then, of course, there are questions of exclusion and whether countries should be excluded from the contest. And of course, EBU had different answers in the cases of Russia and Israel, and there has been a lot of backlash against that. And yet, it is not a competition of governments, as the EBU says. So there is a lot to debate that on the tensions, as you mentioned, between inclusion and exclusion. And I think also about this utopia that the Eurovision wants to create. So I think what we might be witnessing now, and what was very evident to me in Malmo this year, is that the discourse is perhaps shifting from the Eurovision trying to spread these values of peace and love to the world, to the Eurovision right now perhaps focusing on trying to protect what it has. So one term that kept coming up last week was the bubble. And I thought it was very interesting to see the Eurovision now trying to protect our bubble rather than Europe as a whole, rather than to sort of like spread these values or to celebrate these values European-wide, but to protect the bubble that already exists, which is Eurovision. And I think that is a very interesting shift, and it will be very interesting to see how it unfolds in the coming years, where obviously a lot of these tensions are going to keep coming up.
Well, I really look forward to reading more scholarly contributions from you and others on this topic, as well as the previously mentioned ones. But finally, I would like to hear from you, which was your personal favorite performance in Malmö?
I should say that Italy was my original favorite and Croatia was my ultimate favorite. And I should also say that Petra's act in the second semi-final, the host, where there was a very nice acknowledgement of how Finland almost won last year's Eurovision, and according to many people should have won last year's Eurovision. I think Petra's act in the second semi-final, where she did some kind of a very nice gesture to Finland, was also a very, very good performance this year.
And it was definitely very, very funny. I enjoyed it as well, even if I only saw it on the screen. Thank you so much, Elad. It was a great pleasure talking to you today, and I really look forward to reading more of your future projects.
Thank you so much, Malin. It was really fun.